Disclaimer: I do not own any of the footage presented here. This video was made merely to pay homage to these films and not for any profit or commercial reasons. No copyright infringement intended. The footages are copyrighted and courtesy by their respective owners. This video is a non-profit film for the private use and entertainment purposes only, and is not intended for sales or any sort. Copyright disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act 1976. Allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. Fair use is the use permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Non-profit, educational, or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use. Thank you. Enjoy the documentary. The arrival of digital cameras and smartphones have made photography mainstream. A medium that is over 2 centuries years old was changed on its head in the past 2 decades. It continues to evolve, and in the age of social media, people are using photography to capture and share moments of joy, celebration, and love. We stroll down memory lane and examine how the digital camera has evolved from Kodak's original 1975 digital camera prototype to the iPhone. 1975 Kodak digital camera prototype. In 1975, Kodak engineer Steve Sasson created the first ever digital camera. It was built using parts of kits and leftovers around the Kodak factory and an early CCD image sensor from Fairchild in 1974. The camera was about the size of a breadbox, and it took 23 seconds to capture a single image. It took 0.01 megapixel images shot only in black and white that was saved to a cassette tape. Now guys, I would like to present to you an interview of the inventor of the first digital camera, Mr. Steve Sasson, who was an engineer from Kodak.
Well, I first came to Kodak in 1973, and I was working in a small research laboratory in the apparatus division back then. And I was in an electronics group, and there was a very small project that my supervisor, Gareth Lloyd, came to me in 1974 and suggested that I had a choice, actually, between 2 projects. One was to do, I remember the conversation, actually, like it was yesterday. He said there's 2 projects, real small ones. One was to look at the exposure controls for XL movie cameras, and the other was to look at the imaging performance of these new type of devices called charge-coupled device imagers. And in college, I had done some work on optically controlled silicon devices, and so I was interested in how light affected silicon. So I jumped at the chance to do work with this new device called the charge-coupled device. So that's kind of how it started. And at the point when I looked at this, I looked at the device and I said, well, maybe if I was good to measure the imaging performance, I could try to build something that captured images. So maybe I could build a camera. And then from there it escalated to, wouldn't it be really neat to build a camera with all electronic, no moving parts whatsoever? And then because my experience was largely digital, I decided to take a completely digital approach to it. It avoided a lot of mechanical complexity, which I was incapable of dealing with. So I just basically had a white piece of paper and started to sketch out what this thing would have to be like. And then with the help of 2 enormously talented technicians that were working in the labs, there was named Jim Schickler and Bob Dieger, were 2 fellows, really experienced fellows, and they and I basically cleaned out a back lab and started to build our circuits and put together our camera and do our experiments, one after the other as we put together the camera, until finally the camera and the corresponding playback system was operational. And that was after about a year's worth of work, as I remember, and it was we took our first picture in December of 1975. Jim Schickler and I worked shoulder to shoulder in the lab for many months to get this all to come together, and finally one day the camera was working, we felt, and the playback unit was working. Now all you could see was voltage measurements and oscilloscope traces. There were no images to see. We thought, well, we got to take a picture of something. We got to try it. And Jim looked at me and I looked at him and we said, we got to find something better to take a picture of. So we walked down the hallway outside our laboratory and found a lab technician. Her name was Joy Marshall at the time. As a young lab technician, she was sitting at a teletype. I remember this because I was holding the camera and I went up to her and I asked her, can I take a picture? She knew that we were these strange people in the back lab doing something, and she looked at the camera and said, well, okay. And so I took a head and shoulders shot of her. She had black hair, was against sort of a white background. And the camera started to work, started to record, and we went back to the lab. We popped the tape out of the camera, put it into the playback unit, and then up popped the image. And the picture was, you could see the silhouette of the hair, you could see the white background, but her face was complete static. But Jim and I were just overwhelmingly happy with what we saw, because there were 1,000 reasons why you would see absolutely nothing. And we knew them all. And I remember standing with Jim, looking at this, saying, so much is working. And Jim said, yeah, man, a lot is really working. Now, Joy had followed us into the lab. She was standing behind us, and she was looking over our shoulder. She looked at the picture, and she said, needs work, turned around and walked out. And indeed, I had mixed up the order of the bits when I recorded it on the tape in the camera, and I thought that they were in a certain order, and I reversed the order when I was pulling them off the tape for the playback unit. So if it was all ones or all zeros, that is black or all white, it came out okay, but anything else in between was wrong. We figured it out after about an hour, and then the picture popped into view, and boy, we were happy then. Then the picture looked good. So that was the first picture. I like to kid people that if I had known anybody would have been interested in this camera 30 years later, we would have made it a lot prettier. If you saw the camera, it's kind of an odd collection of circuit boards in a steel frame with a blue box sitting on top and a lens sticking out. And the camera weighs about 8.5 pounds, and as I remember, it's about 8 inches wide and 6 inches deep and about 9 inches high. So about the size of a small toaster, and like I say, weighed about as much as a toaster. Now, I guess I stretched my credibility by saying it was handheld, but at the time I could hold it. You could hold it and take pictures with it. So we called it a handheld camera. I began to realize that there was a lot more to this when I started making the presentations. In 1976, we started making internal presentations of the camera, where I would demonstrate the camera with people in the room. And, I was all ready to answer questions about how it worked, right? I'd spent a year telling you all the little technical tricks we pulled to get this to work. And, they asked me questions about what the impact of this would be, what the ramifications would be. Why would anybody want to look at their picture on a television set? How are they going to store these pictures? What's an electronic photo album going to look like? Well, I really hadn't thought about any of that, And I always asked, when is this going to actually be practical? I really hadn't thought about any of that. And so to one extent, I was sort of disappointed no one was going to ask me all the technical details. But on the other hand, the conversations that ensued were really kind of interesting. And I was sort of a participant in people thinking about the future. If I look back over the 30 years, as much as we thought things would happen, even so much more happened, And I think it's a general comment about anytime you're inventing anything, you look at your invention, but realize that the rest of the world's inventing along with you. So we didn't think about things like the internet or wide bandwidth connections or desktop photographic printing, like thermal printing or inkjet print. Those kinds of things really weren't in our discussion process at the time, So discussion. So I think I'm amazed. I've witnessed it firsthand. It's astounding to see what can happen over 30 years. It's just hard to predict. Work that you did over 30 years ago, now it gets people are really interested in it. I'm happy and I'm gratified that people are sort of take up and notice that Kodak was really doing pioneering work. I look at this as they're really honoring the Eastman Kodak Company and the innovative work they've done over the years. Hundreds of men and women over the years have done pioneering work in digital photography. We have fundamental intellectual property rights. If you're an experimenter and you're an inventor or anything like that, you really do spend most of your time failing. You really do. So you learn so much from that, You just have to sort of go forward with your ideas. And lots of times they may not work out. They may not work out right then. Or they may work out if somebody else does something to it, You're part of a big community going forward. You're not really alone when you're inventing. But I would just say don't be afraid of failure and enjoy yourself and have fun.
That was a very interesting and an informative interview. Now let's move on to the next camera that was invented. 1988 Fuji Fujex DS1P. First unveiled at the 1988 Photokenner trade show in Cologne, Germany, Fujex DS1P is considered as the first true digital camera. It used to record images in a 2 MB SRAM memory card that held 5 to a maximum of 10 photographs. Like the Kodak camera, this Fuji-made camera was never sold. Now, let's move on to 1991. The Kodak DCS-100. In 1991, Kodak created the first ever digital SLR. The Kodak Digital Camera System DCS was essentially a modified Nikon F3, whose film chamber and window were modified to make room for sensors. The camera had a built-in 1.3 megapixel Kodak CCD to capture images. The camera costed $20,000 and required an external data storage unit that the photographer needed to wear on a shoulder strap and was connected via cable. Now, in 1994, even Apple stepped into the camera market. They launched the Apple QuickTake. Often considered as the first mainstream digital camera under $1,000, Apple QuickTake used to take color images at a VGA resolution. The QuickTake was designed by Kodak and manufactured by Chinon in Japan. The QuickTake 100 had a fixed 50mm equivalent f2 lens, an optical viewfinder, and an LCD display to view the settings. It was Apple's first venture into digital camera space. Now again in 1994, Kodak launched a new camera. They called it Kodak AP NC2000. In 1994, Kodak and Associated Press launched a digital SLR designed for photojournalists. Based on a Nikon N9C body, the 1.3 megapixel camera had removable memory cards and up to ISO 1600. The Vancouver Sun became the world's first newspaper to convert to all digital photography with this camera. Originally priced at $17,950 but discounted to $16,950 for AP members. Now let's take a quick detour from the topic. Here are some interesting fun facts about photography. Number 1. Sir John Herschel originally coined the word photography in 1839. Number 2. Digital cameras have outsold film cameras since 2003. Number 3. The Dicam Model 1 was the first commercially available digital camera to launch in the US in 1990. Number 4. The biggest photography company, Kodak, filed for bankruptcy protection in 2012. Number 5. The most popular picture on Instagram is currently a picture of an egg with over 40 million likes. Wow, those were some really interesting fun facts. Let's move on. Now let's move forward in time to 1995, when Ricoh launched their camera called RDC-1. The Ricoh RDC-1 was the first digital camera to have a dedicated movie mode. Its video recording capabilities were fairly limited, but still, this camera was pretty revolutionary. The camera could record 5-second 768 into 480 pixel clips at 30 frames per second and save them in then new MPEG formats. It was an expensive camera costing an estimated $1,500. Now let's move on to 1999, when Kyocera VP210 was launched. Kyocera Visual Phone VP210 was the world's first camera phone. Yes, a mobile phone with a built-in camera. The Visual Phone VP210 had a 0.11 megapixel front camera and was launched in 1999. It could store 20 stills and transmit live video at a rate of 2 FPS. The VP210 was quickly followed by the Samsung SCH V200 and Sharp J SH04 the following year. Now let's move on to 2000, when the Fujifilm Finpix S1 Pro was launched. The Fujifilm Finpix S1 Pro was the first interchangeable lens DSLR to hit the market. Priced at $3,500, it was marketed as a camera for serious amateur photographers. It was based on the Nikon N60 that was modified by Fujifilm to include its own image sensor. Given that the S1 Pro had a Nikon F mount, it was compatible with all Nikon manual and AF lenses. The Finpix S1 Pro had Fuji's 3.1 megapixel APS-C format Super CCD sensor that output images with a resolution of 6.13 megapixels and enabled sensitivity settings up to ISO 1600. Now let's move on to 2007, 7 years after the last camera was launched. Now we're talking about the iPhone. The The world changed when Apple CEO Steve Jobs launched the iPhone in 2007. It had a capacitive touchscreen and the camera so good that it changed the camera industry forever. It wasn't the first phone to have a camera, but there's that convenience factor that made the first iPhone so popular among consumers. Till date, the iPhone continues to be the most popular camera in the markets. Here is the image of the mastermind Steve Jobs holding the iPhone in 2007. The future of cameras. The camera of the future could redefine ultra compact though. Manufacturers could create cameras that are 0.5 inches in thickness. This prediction makes some sense as digital cameras from a decade ago are much larger than today's smaller cameras, and the high-tech components inside continue to shrink. Thank you. Now, I would like to show you all the bibliography of this documentary. Acknowledgement. I would like to thank my family and teachers at school for giving me this wonderful opportunity to make this documentary. Now, I would like to give myself credit for the research, editing, and the voiceover done in this documentary. Now we arrived to the end of the documentary. Thank you all for watching.